Oh, hey, welcome. So I was just assembling a glucose molecule here. Um, plants spend a lot of their time making molecules like this, glucose molecules, um, for energy. And we had a whole chapter on that. Chapter, I think it was 9, on cellular respiration and how we get the energy from glucose. So it took me a while to make this, and it takes plants a while to make this too, because there's a lot of chemical bonds there, and all the chemical bonds that are there have stored energy. This is like a battery. There is potential energy in this molecule. And in this chapter, the first one of the 8 animal systems that we're going to look at, we're going to discuss how animals have ways of getting this molecule inside of them and then breaking it down so that we can use it. Now, again, we're not going to go into all the chemistry of cellular respiration because we've already done that, but what kind of systems are available for animals in general to break this molecule down? And you'll see it's different for different animals. So there would be a glucose molecule with good potential energy there from those bonds. And so now, without further ado, let's get right into this. This is the first section, again, 27.1, regarding feeding and digestion. Those occur in that order. Feeding refers to getting the food in. Digestion refers to breaking the food down. All right? That molecule does us no good if we can't break all those bonds to make ATP. So, if you'll just now follow along with me here. Let me make sure this works here. Right, switching to my computer. Okay, perfect. Now I just need to go to my PowerPoint here. And all right, so feeding and digestion. So we're basically going to look at, again, how do animals obtain food, and then how does digestion occur? Digestion refers to breaking food down. And so also we're going to look at different mouth parts and how they're adapted for different diets. Okay, so obtaining food. How do you get it inside? How do you get it? All right. Well, the first one of the types of organisms is called a filter feeder. Filter feeders are pretty awesome because they literally can just filter their food. I mean, it's there for the taking, and they just filter it. And they just catch it. Like here you can see most filter feeders, they catch algae and small animals by using modified gills or other structures as nets that filter food items out of the water. So pretty simple. I mean, it's basically just like a big soup of material, and organisms can just filter the food out. Now check this out. There's 2 types here. Invertebrate filter feeders. The invertebrates are the phylums of animals that don't have a vertebrate, so they're a little less complex animals. But your invertebrate filter feeders are small. They're usually colonial organisms. They live in colonies like worms or sponges, and they spend their adult lives in a single spot, and they just sit there and filter stuff. While vertebrate filter feeders, such as whale sharks and blue whales, some of the largest organisms on Earth, they're huge, and they also use filter feeding. So just because you're a filter feeder doesn't mean you're small or large, right? You can go both ways. Here's a really cool picture I found. Let's see. I know while you guys were in Monterey Bay, you probably got to see this, and you probably heard the marine biologist on the boat talk about this. But whales have a really interesting feature called a baleen, and so they're sometimes called baleen feeders. And they have this really cool structure here. Hopefully, you guys, while you're on the boat, they showed you one of these. The last time I was there, they had one of these baleens just sitting around on the boat, and they were passing it around. And it's really cool. It has all these little hairs on it. They look like little hairs. And those act as a way to filter all of the particles, what we call plankton. It's how you filter the plankton in the water and let the water back out of the mouth and keep the plankton behind. And so it's real important to keep these intact and really well intact and well functioning. Otherwise, the whale would actually die because it relies on this filter. Okay, kind of like this was like a car engine filter. Kind of like if your car engine didn't have a good air filter, it was clogged or whatever, your car engine wouldn't run because it needs air into the engine. Well, the opposite's true with the whale. If it wasn't able to hold stuff in, then it couldn't get the water out, or whatever. You want this filter system to work well. Water to leave and food to stay back inside. I love this picture here. It says 500,000 calories in a mouthful. 500,000 calories in one mouthful because their mouths are so big. There's so many organisms in that water. And so this is interesting too. I found this on a website while I was looking up the baleen. There's a nice close-up picture of the baleen. And what they found in this website, I was reading it, is that plastic debris is actually more of a risk than oil for filter feeding whales. So we kind of stress out about oil, thinking the oil might clog this baleen and make the whale, essentially starve because it won't work right and filter right. But this article suggests after the study, they found that the small pieces of plastic will clog the baleen and may pose a greater risk to whales than ingestion of oil. They found that the oil was actually not absorbed into the baleen and that it quickly washed away. But small plastic particles became trapped and lodged in the baleen, leading to the baleen not working well. So let me close that out. I don't need that anymore. So now, let's move on to the next type of way of obtaining food. If you don't want to just simply filter it, you can break down bits and pieces of dead decaying plant or animal material, and that's what detritivores do. You might remember some of these terms from the ecology unit. Detritivores, they basically feed on what's called detritus. Detritus is just dead, decaying bits of plant and animal material. And so they're going to get extra nutrients from bacteria, algae, and other microorganisms that grow on or around it as well. So, but the idea is that detritivores, like earthworms, they feed on detritus by breaking down those decaying bits of plant and animal material. From earthworms on land to a wide range of worms and crustaceans in aquatic habitats, detritivores are essential actually for many ecosystems. That's why we brought it up in the ecology unit, because detritivores are like the last step in the chain that will help break down material so that it's available for the other organisms, because eventually you want stuff to break down completely. All right, carnivores are obviously organisms that eat other animals. Right? They don't eat plants, they eat animals. Okay, if you eat both, you're an omnivore. But carnivores, they usually strictly eat other animals. And so we've already talked about those. We've also talked about herbivores, which strictly eat plants. All right. And so we're not going to even go into that much more. You guys know what herbivore is. Now, nutritional symbionts. Let's talk about those. Nutritional symbionts, if you remember that word symbiosis from the ecology unit, it means living together. So symbiosis means living together. And there's actually many animals that rely on symbiosis for their nutritional needs. Here's the first example: parasitic symbionts, or parasitic symbiosis. So for this type of relationship, again, all these terms I remember from the ecology unit. Parasitic organisms are ones that benefit from feeding on a host, but that the host is negatively affected. Now, here's what's interesting about parasites. They live within or on a host, but they don't kill the host. All right, they don't kill the host. They just live within or on the host, and they basically hijack the host's diet, and they feed on the tissues or on the blood or other bodily fluids. And so as the host is doing its daily thing, its daily activities, eating and stuff like that, the parasites will end up eating the food after the host has broken it down. How convenient, right? And some parasites are actually just nuisances, but some can cause serious damage, and they end up actually would kill the organism, even though that wasn't the parasite's original intention. like parasitic flatworms and roundworms. Well, they afflict millions of people, particularly in the tropics. I wouldn't say that always kills people. A lot of people survive when they parasitic flatworms, but it could be deadly. It could be deadly because they're eating your nutrients and you become malnourished. Okay, so if you don't get it treated right away, you could end up dying. But the point is, the intention is not for parasites to kill the host. They're trying to live within the host, and sometimes that can even happen just in a way that just barely negatively affects the host. It happens for a long time, actually. We actually have parasites within us all the time, and then we get rid of them, and then we get them. But they're on a small level. Some parasites don't do much harm. Okay, mutualistic symbionts. Remember, the term mutualistic means both organisms benefit. So this is a relationship in which both participants benefit. But we're not just talking about mutualism. We're talking about mutualistic symbionts in terms of nutritional symbionts. So this is we're talking about symbiosis again. We've already discussed it before, but this time we're talking about it in a way that relates to feeding and getting food for nutrients. And so here's the same example that I think was brought up in the last chapter. We discussed that. There are corals that benefit from algae that live within the coral. And what's really cool, here's how it works. The algae basically produces sugars because the algae is photosynthetic. And so it produces sugars for the coral. And then the algae also benefits from the waste that the coral produced. All right, does that make sense? So the algae, they capture solar energy from the sun, they recycle nutrients, and they help the corals lay down their calcium carbonate skeletons. And they in turn gain nutrition from the coral's waste, and they also get protection from algae eaters. Here's a good, I found this. Yeah, here you go. So here's a coral here with the tentacles and such, and the mouth and the gas. We're going to talk about those in just a second, but you see this term here, zooxanthel. Those are the photosynthetic organisms that live in the cells. They actually reside within the cells and in the tissues. I think that's very interesting how they do that. Here's a sea anemone. Hopefully you saw some of these when you're on your Monterey Bay trip. They look really pretty when they're open like this. When the water's not there, though, and the tide goes down, these kind of fold up into kind of like blob structures like this, and they're not so attractive. But when the water's there, they're really neat, and they're really colorful. And they just, we'll talk about how they digest in just a second. But one thing they do have going for them is the algae that lives within them. So those algae are called zooxanthellae, and they live within the tissues of the anemone, and they are basically going to, again, here's interesting, I forgot to say, those photosynthetic organisms not only make food, but if you remember from photosynthesis, they also make oxygen for the organism as well. So, and the sugar that's produced is, we call it glycerol, as one of the sugars, glucose and alanine. It's an amino acid that the sea anemone can benefit from. So as photosynthesis is happening, these zooxanthellae are producing sugar, amino acids, and oxygen. So they're really benefiting the sea anemone. And the algae is also benefiting too, because they're getting protection from people that might want to eat them. Now, this is here's another mutualism example with the clownfish. That's the one that was brought up in the ecology unit. The clownfish is benefiting from protection, but there's not really like a mutualistic nutritional symbiosis there. Like the sea anemone is not eating the clownfish, so it doesn't really benefit in that way. But it is mutualism. They both benefit. The clownfish benefits from the protection, and the sea anemone benefits because the clownfish will attack other organisms that would be bad for the clownfish. They help clean. Anemones get a cleaning, basically, and better water circulation from the fish that are swimming in and out around the tentacles. Most fish would die if they were around those tentacles, but clownfish have an immunity to the stinging nettles there. All right, cool. So back to our PowerPoint here. Do we have any other nutritional symbionts? No, we're just going with those two there, parasitic and mutualistic. Okay, know the difference between those two. Don't worry about this analyzing data. We're going to skip that. Processing food. Now, here's where it gets good, right? It's pretty easy to get the food in. We've discussed how you can do that. You can filter it. You can filter it, or you can get down the smaller pieces and break those down further, or you can eat plants or animals, right? Or you can have symbiotic relationships like this. But how do we get the food broken down? How do we process it? This is real important, because the food is pointless if you can't actually break it down so that it can get into all your cells. You have to remember every cell needs energy. Every cell needs energy. And in fact, remember this chapter, cellular respiration, where we had glucose going through glycolysis and then also being processed in the mitochondria to make ATP. ATP is the energy that powers the cell and the organism. So how does that occur? How do we get the glucose into the cells? How do you do that? So check it out. The one way you can do it is intracellular digestion. Now, this is like super basic right here. Animals, these are going to be the simplest of the animals. Animals such as sponges, like this over here, a sponge, will digest food that way. They have specialized cells that can pass nutrients to other cells too, which is interesting. But that's intracellular. That's different than the extracellular. So intra means within, extra means outside. Intra means inside, extra means outside. And so we're looking at inside, intracellular digestion. And here's a good picture here. So here's we have a top and bottom here. On the top is intracellular, on the bottom is extracellular. So let's look at the top, since we're talking about intracellular right now. Basically, you have these cells, right, all lined up next to each other, and they need nutrients. Well, outside the cell, you'll have a food particle, and what the cell can do is ingest that food particle, just like you ingest your meals in your mouth. And literally, the food particle goes into the cell, and then there's enzymes that will break down that food particle into the nutrients. It'll break down the food particles into smaller and smaller molecules so that the nutrients can be available to the cell. All right. Now, that's a lot of work. That's a lot of work, and that's a lot to ask for a cell to do, right? For us and most organisms, we do what's down here, extracellular digestion. We do all that stuff outside the cell. And then, don't get it wrong though, nutrients still have to get into the cell. Every cell needs nutrients. Every cell needs nutrients. So you see here how the cell has absorbed nutrients into the cell? That has to occur in both cases. If you were to do a Venn diagram, that would be the similarity in the middle. Both cells need nutrients. But the digestion occurs outside of the cell in what's called a gut cavity, and that looks different for different organisms, and we're going to discuss that in just a moment and what some different organs look like. But the point is, you're going to have some cavity outside of the cell where all of the breaking down occurs. All right? And so I can probably kill that now because I'm going back to PowerPoint, not going back to that again. All right, now, so extracellular digestion again occurs outside the cell. And so what does that look like? Well, for the simplest of organisms, you could have just simply a gastrovascular cavity like you see here in the cnidarian. That's actually a sea anemone that we just looked at. The sea anemones that we just looked at, that would be a cnidarian. And basically the way they feed is they have this opening in the middle, right? You see that opening in the middle? And then food will come in. It'll get broken down. It'll get broken down in that cavity. The nutrients will go into the cells, and then all that waste will just go right back out the same hole. So literally the mouth and the anus are the same hole. It's just one cavity, right? One opening that leads to this cavity. That's pretty simple and not super complex. I wasn't going to say efficient. It is efficient, all right? It is efficient, but at the same time, you can't do two. It's not efficient. And that doesn't make sense. Let me rephrase that. It's efficient for that organism because it's so easy. It's so easy. Food, water, and food can just come in and then out the same hole. Like, not a whole lot going on there. You don't have to have a whole lot of problems to worry about. But you can't be a very complex animal, though. And so, for organisms like us that are more complex, we're going to use digestive tracts. And you don't have to be a vertebrate for that. You could even be an invertebrate. But many invertebrates and all vertebrates, definitely all vertebrates, such as birds, digest food in a tube called the digestive tract, which, check this out, here it is, has 2 openings. That's the key to a digestive tract, is that you're going to have 2 openings, one for the mouth for food going in, and one called the anus where the food goes out, or the waste goes out. Okay, and it's always going through one direction. You see how you have food coming in, where's the... here's a bird. You have a food coming in the mouth, and then it goes through all the different organs that are in the digestive system, and then it goes out the anus. Okay, so it goes in one, out the other. Where that's different from this example in the sea anemone, where the food goes in and out the same hole. All right, and so one-way digestive tracts are awesome. They're super awesome because they can be specialized to do a lot more work and different tasks as different foods pass through them. And I like this. You can think of a digestive tract kind of as a disassembly line. So again, like I started out in the beginning of the lecture, I showed you that glucose molecule. It needs to be broken down. How does that happen? Well, first of all, the glucose was probably in some other molecule that was even larger, and it needed to be broken down. So food also comes in big chunks that we got to break down, right? And so there has to be organs that do that, and that's what's really cool about a digestive tract. So there's a lot of mechanical digestion that occurs in these kind of structures, and there's also chemical digestion as well. You know what the difference between that is, right? Mechanical digestion is just breaking food down mechanically. Imagine taking like a hammer, or anybody ever I make a chocolate cheesecake, and one of the recipes I use calls to take Oreos and smash them in a Ziploc bag with a hammer to finer pieces so that you can make the crust. It's a nice Oreo crust, and that would just be mechanical, just breaking it down. But chemical digestion is a whole nother ballgame. That's actually breaking the chemical bonds in the molecule, and that requires chemicals, requires enzymes and chemicals, digestive enzymes. And so no matter how efficiently, though, an animal breaks down food and extracts nutrients, there's always going to be some indigestible material that always will be left. And so that solid waste or feces is expelled through the single digestive opening or through the anus. So that's what's cool about having 2 openings. Food coming in with everything. You break it down, get all the good stuff, and then poop out what is not beneficial for you, that you could not use. Any materials that you could not use for making other molecules or for energy, you just get rid of it. And so poop is worthless, literally. Well, I guess you could probably find some worth. Anyways, we're not going to go there. All right. So again, I like this figure, and it's always good to look at figures and read these. When you see stuff like this, this is good. Figure 27.2. Animals have different digestive structures. The sponge has a digestive opening and uses intracellular digestion to process food. That's A. That would be this structure here, A, the sponge. That's just intracellular, super simple. Literally, each cell is having to eat is having to do all of the work we just discussed in extracellular digestion. Each cell is having to engulf the food and break it down. That's a lot to ask for each cell. But in B, the cnidarian processes food by extracellular digestion in a cavity, which is a whole lot more efficient. All right, and then C, the bird, this is going to be a one-way digestive tract with 2 openings, a mouth and an anus, which is even more efficient. All right, so specialized mouth parts for diets. Depending on what you eat, you're going to need specialized mouth parts to do some of that mechanical digestion. All right, and so teeth are going to be great mechanical digesters. And for teeth, we're not going to go super deep into this because I know you guys have obviously heard these terms a lot, but some of this might be unfamiliar to you. So let's dive in. For carnivores, animals that eat meat, they're going to have these type of teeth. The herbivores are on the right. Here's the skull of an herbivore. They're going to have these type of teeth. All right, and so let's look at this diagram. This is probably the best way to study that. Believe it or not, both are going to have canines. It's kind of interesting. Canines are going to be pointed teeth, but they're going to serve a different purpose in the carnivore and the herbivore. For carnivores, they're used for piercing, gripping, and tearing. A good thing to do is if you have a highlighter or you're trying to organize this information yourself, maybe make a table, carnivore on one side, herbivore on the other, and then make rows of the different teeth, like canines, molars, incisors, and then write the functions different because the functions are different. For carnivores that eat meat, again, the canine teeth are for, pay attention to the adjectives, that's what it's all about. I'm sorry, the verbs, not adjectives. The verbs, right? The action verbs. Piercing, all right? So grabbing a hold of the prey, gripping and holding the prey, and tearing the prey, all right? And herbivores, they're just reduced, but they're still there, interestingly enough. Sometimes they're not, though. Sometimes they're absent. Right? That's what this is saying here. But sometimes you actually will see very small canine teeth on even herbivores, suggesting that maybe they're an omnivore. I don't know. Like us, we have canines as well. We have small, a couple little canines. Ish, I would say, canine-ish. Now in the back of our mouth, and for other carnivores, you have molars. And then for the molars, they're going to be really, really sharp edges. They're going to have sharp edges, and that's going to be used for slicing and dicing. There's your highlighter again. Those are your verbs, slicing and dicing. And so this is really cool. These teeth have ridges that interlock during chewing like blades of scissors. So you see how the blades of the scissors do most of their work actually when the blades cross each other? That's kind of what's happening here. When you have your top molars and your bottom molars, when they come across each other, they end up doing that kind of scissor-like action. And that's why it's actually real important. Dentistry is pretty important for animals or for us human beings. Like the dentist doesn't just make your teeth look pretty; they actually make them work right. And so if your molars and premolars aren't there, you're going to have a hard time doing all that slicing and dicing, or even if they're not lined up well. So you'll see a lot of dentists, for other reasons too, they make sure your teeth line up whenever you bite down, so that the ridges that are there that will interlock with the ridges on the top. All right, the top teeth line up with the bottom teeth, just like the blades of scissors will slide nice and neat past each other. If you ever try to use a loose pair of scissors, they don't work very well. You want it to be just right. For the herbivores, they also have molars and premolars, but they're a little bit different. They're broad. They're flattened. If you ever look at a horse, you'll see that. Like their molars are just like they look like flat, like these structures here, and they are going to be used for grinding, or sometimes we use the word rasping. And that's just like grinding down, or scraping. So just going a lot of side-to-side action to break down leaf material and wear it down, almost like sandpaper as well. Okay, and then so there's a difference there. For us, we kind of have these, not so much like this animal here, but our molars and premolars, they don't look like a horse necessarily. They're not that flat, but we do have some ridges on them. But we do have some in the very back that almost look like this. So we're very omnivorous. We're kind of in between here. We're in between a carnivore and an herbivore. Incisors, those are going to be like fingernail clippers. Those are the best example of incisors. You ever try to first like grab onto your food where you like grab with your front teeth? Those are your incisors. Your incisors are your little front teeth. They're pointless for doing too much work, but they are great for like cutting, gnawing, or grooming, right? So if you really want to do some really precise work, you're going to use your incisors. So your front teeth are great for doing like little meticulous, like cutting or gnawing or grooming, but they're not going to be great for doing too much slicing or dicing or anything like that, or grinding or rasping, right? So you want all your teeth. They all have a function, from your canines to your incisors to your molars and premolars. They all have a function. All right, we're about to finish this up, guys. For eating meat again, you're going to want sharp mouth parts again that slice and dice into small pieces, because meat is tough. Meat is tough. And as far as the rest of the digestive system goes, you're going to usually have kind of short digestive tracts that allow the meat to pass through pretty quickly. You don't want it hanging around in your gut for too long. You have chemicals that'll break it down pretty quick, and you'll be good. Now, eating plants, though, it gets a little different here. We actually have a whole paragraph here where we're going to talk about how animals have to do something special if they solely rely on eating like plant leaves and grass and stuff like that. First of all, their mouth parts have to be adapted for or created for grinding or rasping again, right? Because you got to break down all those leaves and expose. It could break the cell walls of the plant. Cell walls are tough. You got to break those cell walls, and you got to expose all the cellular contents. And so, actually, to do this, many invertebrates, from mollusks to insects, have mouth parts that do that. They pulverize the leaf tissues, and they also have other mouth parts here that you can see. Like the horse is one of their kind of famous mouth parts, is their front. Now, those front, remember, are incisors. Those are not molars. Those are incisors, and those are great for like grabbing onto the leaf and like cutting it. So they basically like make a cut right there. So the incisors are really sharp. Don't put your hand in a horse mouth. And then it also, interestingly enough, the jaw bones and the jaw muscles are even adapted to do side-to-side motion and side-to-side grinding. Now, here's where it gets fun. I love chemistry, so I'm going to go on a little rant here. You have to have a specialized digestive tract for animals that eat plants or cellulose. And here's why. It's because of the cellulose. Has anybody ever heard of how a cow has 4 stomachs? Or has a rumen, and they chew their cud. They regurgitate their food and then chew it and swallow it again. Why do they do that? Why do they have 4 stomachs? Why do they have a rumen? Why do they have a rumen? Well, here's why. So glucose is what we need for cellular respiration, right? That's the molecule I showed you in the beginning. There's all these chemical bonds between the carbons and the hydrogens. This is the monomer for glucose. Well, that's what goes through cellular respiration. Again, remember, you go through glycolysis and the mitochondria to make ATP and all that. Well, plants take glucose and they combine the glucoses together to form long polymers, where the monomer is glucose and the polymer is a long complex sugar called starch. Starch is just made up of a bunch of glucose monomers. Interestingly enough, if you take starch and you put it in your mouth, you can actually leave it there, and there's an enzyme in your mouth called starch amylase that will break these bonds here in between the glucoses, and it'll taste sweet. It'll taste sweet because you'll be now exposing the individual glucoses to your taste buds. But right away, starch is not sweet because all the glucoses are connected like this. And so we have an enzyme that can digest starch. It breaks these bonds here. Right, here's the enzyme. It's a protein. Speaking of the last chapter, it's a protein that acts as an enzyme, which causes a chemical reaction to occur to break this bond right here. Well, cellulose is actually almost the same molecule. It's glucose, 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 glucose. They look very similar. If you're looking from far away, you can't tell the difference between starch and cellulose. And they're made up of the same molecules, a bunch of glucoses. But you see how the oxygens are all pointing down here? This oxygen's pointing down, this one's pointing down, this one's pointing down. The enzyme can break that bond, and then we're good. But you see how this oxygen's pointing up, this one's pointing down, but then this one's pointing up again? These oxygens that are pointing up, we do not have an enzyme that can break that. It's hard to digest. You can't digest cellulose. You can try to eat the grass and cellulose fibers all day long, but you're not going to get energy from it because we do not have enzymes. Our bodies don't make it. Animals don't make enzymes that break these bonds here. And so what's really cool is that there's bacteria that can do that. And so the way it works is the cow has this big, large rumen here. The cow will eat the cellulose. It'll pass through the esophagus and it'll hang out in the rumen, which is it's like a chemical factory. I saw this was interesting. Like, you have grain and yesterday's hay at the bottom, you have today's hay in the middle, and then you have gases at the top. You just have a whole lot of chemical activity going on here. And basically, it's nutritional symbiosis. You have bacteria that are here living in the cow that are benefiting the cow because it's breaking down the cellulose and turning it into glucose. It's turning it into glucose that the cow can use. And also the bacteria can use it. So they're benefiting. The bacteria are benefiting and the cow's benefiting. And so what happens is it's actually quite complex. The cow has the rumen, and then after that it'll go into the reticulum, and then it'll get regurgitated. The cow will chew it again and swallow it back again to go into the omenasum, and then the abomasum, and whatever, which is like your regular stomach, and then it goes to the small intestines. But after it does all this work, it's ready for absorption, which happens in the small intestines, by the way. Even in our stomach is only good for churning and turning and breaking food down. You have stomach acid that can literally eat metal, but we have a mucus lining that protects our stomach. So you have, with your stomach acids and all the juices that you have in your stomach, and enzymes that can break food down, basically that's just getting it all ready for absorption in the small intestines, which is quite long, and absorption takes a long time, so it passes through the long intestines for a long time. It passes through the small intestines for a long time before entering the large intestines, which is mostly just getting the water back out and back into your body. You don't want to poop out water, right? You want solid poop. So you reabsorb water in the large intestines. The small intestines is very runny. It's actually a substance called chyme. It's a very runny and super nutrient-rich substance because it's been broken down. The food's been pulverized in the mouth mechanically, chemically digested in the stomach. And so our digestive system's similar to this as far as mechanically breaking down, chemically breaking down, and then absorbing and then getting rid of. But cows, they have this very special rumen that allows them to break down cellulose, which we cannot. Remember, we can break down starch. We can break down starch, but we can't break down cellulose. So that's why this rumen is so special, because it has symbiotic bacteria that can digest cellulose. I know if you just read that sentence, you probably wouldn't have made a whole lot of sense of that, but actually being able to see the molecules and stuff like that, hopefully I thought that would make it make more sense. All right, so if you guys will just do 1 through 3, don't do number 4. I tried to answer some of these questions as I did this lecture, so that those of you who are watching these videos, and I'll continue to do that. As I do my videos, I'll make sure to answer these questions throughout my lectures, so it pays off to watch the videos instead of. But if you want to just read the book, you can too. That is absolutely fine as well. I want you guys to manage your time the best way you can. And so if you're still watching this video, my advice is that you do 2 sections. If you haven't read this already, my advice is that you do 2 sections a week. 2 times 4 is 8. That's 8 sections in 4 weeks. We have 5 weeks left. That'll leave you with the 5th week of just being able to take the test, and that's it. That's all you have to worry about on that 5th week, which is actually finals week. And so for the final, we'll just be having the test on chapter 27 and 28. All right, stay tuned for 27.2, the next animal system. Stay tuned.